How much I want to invite you to think before you listen to this wonderful conversation with Jennifer Weston, CEO of the organization 7,000 Languages and citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation. How much I invite you to consider the role of language as part of your identity, as part of your personal history, as part of your connection with not only those around you in the present, but with those in the past. Jennifer tells powerful stories of her own experience with language and naming. She also shares powerful stories of the identity of communities through language, identification, reclamation, preservation, expansion, all parts of the work that she has done in many different areas, but in particular with a focus on the 7,000 language experience. Start with yourself. Start with your own identity and your own connections through language, and then enjoy this powerful conversation with Jennifer Weston. Jennifer Weston, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to It's About Language. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Wopilatanka. Thank you, Norah. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I am so interested in talking to you about so many different things, and I have provided in the introduction to this podcast the basic information about you being a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the CEO of 7,000 Languages, but there's so much more. And if I may, with respect to the importance of your name, could you please share with my audience the name that you have received from your great-grandmother and introduce yourself and what you'd like us to know as we begin today?
Of course. Hamadakyapi chante washte nape chiuzapi ksto desang washtewi emachiapi naha iamoslahe wichoti emataha tokoola na Niake Yuzapi. So I'm Jennifer Weston, and I'm from Standing Rock, and I introduced myself to you with a name that was given to me as a child from one of my great-grandmothers, Annie Kilscrow, and she carried the name Des. It means white buffalo woman in Lakota language, and it's a very common name across many Lakota and Dakota reservations because Ptesanwin in our history was an important woman, a very powerful woman who brought our pipe, our chanumpa, and our ceremonies to us. So she was a teacher. She was a defender of women and children. She was a spokeswoman for our ways of life and for carrying forward our teachings and living in Wolakota, or in balance and in harmony with one another. And it was a tremendous surprise to my family when I was gifted this name from one of our grandfathers. As a child, I didn't understand that names were sort of assigned to us, and they were often handed down intergenerationally. And I remember who was always my interpreter at ceremonies as a child. She was very shocked that this was the name that one of my grandfathers had chosen for me. And I think she was a little bit maybe worried as well, because it brings so much responsibility and obligation to be a good relative, to be responsive to requests from loved ones. But I've thought about it as a way to remain connected to my community. So because of my family's work as educators and, teachers in the community, I've always been very focused on wanting to not only be someone who shares our history and our culture, but also provides access to generations coming after me. And that's something that I've been really proud of being able to accomplish in my career so far, is creating new opportunities for language learners. It wasn't something that I grew up with. I went to a very small public high school on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. the same school, K-12, and we did not have Lakota or Dakota language in our local school curriculum. It was a public school. At the time, it was predominantly non-Native students. It's a very different demographic today. And today, Lakota and Dakota language are celebrated and very much embedded in all aspects of the school culture and curriculum. But that wasn't my experience. And I was fortunate that my mother was a teacher, a first speaker of Lakota, and she taught at many of the tribal schools on Standing Rock through her 30-plus year career. But for, working and commuting parents, it was important that to our parents that we could walk to school. And so we went to the local public school because it was just a few blocks away. But Standing Rock is a very large land base. Our tribal reservation spans an area probably a little bit bigger than the state of Connecticut and goes into both North and South Dakota. So I was born on the North Dakota side of Standing Rock in our tribal headquarters, Indian Health Services Hospital, but I grew up on the South Dakota side, which is where my mom was born and raised. And so I spent most of my time in the Bear Soldier and Running Antelope districts on Standing Rock, but have relatives from across the entire reservation from both Dakota and Lakota-speaking families. So when I introduced myself, I mentioned my Shoots the Enemy and Taken Alive relatives who really, I think, are the most, the closest relatives who raised me. But I always want to mention the many other families that I descend from directly. And their names I'm going to share with you in English, but they're beautiful names. And my cousins and I are always talking about how important it is for us to start to learn our ancestral names in our language once again, because sometimes we learn that our languages have been mistranslated. And sometimes we can even refine the ways that we're expressing our family names in English. So I'll start with just a quick list that I want to share with you because these are folks I descend from directly. And I've only really had the opportunity to learn more about them since my mother passed away in 2012. And I inherited some of her land rights on Standing Rock. And so now I receive quarterly land statements that show me the lineage that I descend from. And so some of these names were new to me, but they're names from the Blowsaway family, the Eagleman family, Jaw Hillscrow, Plenty Horses. That's a name from Fort Peck in Montana, actually. The Running Horse family on Standing Rock, the Sitting White Cow family, the Walking Elk family, the Waxhigh family, the White Horse family, the Wind Soldier family, and the Wing family. And so that's in addition to the Shoots the Enemy and Taken Alive ancestors who are my closest aunts and uncles. But I just love, even in English, the sound of everyone's names. And it brings back so many memories of the elders who surrounded me in my childhood and who I grew up hearing speak almost exclusively Lakota and Dakota. But surprisingly, as a young child, I was never encouraged to learn our language. And that's something that always mystifies people. But looking back now, it makes a lot of sense because these were relatives who had experienced directly the impacts from boarding schools. Those may have been church-run schools. They may have even been local day schools. But by and large, our language was not celebrated, was not reinforced as any sort of asset. And I have very vivid memories of my mom's mother, my grandmother, who I probably spent the most time with as a child, telling me that it was so important that I could succeed in English and that I could always come back for my language later. So I feel like that's really what I'm engaged in the work that I'm doing at 7,000 Languages and in my own community organizations as well. But it's so heartbreaking to me to think that all of these generations wanted to protect us. And so they kept silent in their own languages and they emphasized achievement in English because of their own experiences, the stigma, the oppression, and sometimes the abuse that they experienced because of their fluency in their first language. And that was something that even my mom would share often, how when she started school, she doesn't remember how she even learned English or how she even advanced in her early grades. So she thinks she became a proficient English speaker by maybe about the third grade, but she's not even sure how she got to the third grade because she didn't really understand much of what was happening before that. So she spoke exclusively Lakota in her home and really emphasized our participation as children in ceremony and in those practices that as a child were still just emerging from secrecy. So I was born in 1975 and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act wasn't passed until 1978. And so until that time, people could be arrested or, sanctioned locally. And there was a great deal of stigma. There was a lot of discrimination, even from our own families sometimes, because many of our reservations were almost divided up amongst different denominations. So we have just about every denomination that you can think of represented on Standing Rock. But as much as those folks came there with, Christian intentions and wanted to share their faith traditions, they often did that at the expense of our own local culture and our own sense of pride in our culture and our language. And so it's really incredible to me that our language has survived at all, given the range of prejudice that our loved ones experienced, even through my mom's generation. And she was born in the 1950s.
A huge story right there, and just the beginning of the story. What is especially touches your heart, Jennifer, and brings to your work? Broadly defined, we're looking at 7,000 languages because of this podcast's specific focus, but language is used for advocacy for our lives and cultures. What have you found to be the most groundbreaking part for you as you have reflected on your own upbringing and your own opportunities and those changes that you just shared with us?
I think for me, one of the most exciting aspects of joining 7,000 Languages as CEO just last summer, so it hasn't been quite a year, but it's been meeting our fellows and the young people who are actively engaged in language reclamation and revitalization right now, as we speak, all over the world. We had a young man from Cameroon, another young man from Sierra Leone, young people from diverse tribes in California, in Wisconsin, joined the most recent cohort that I had the privilege of learning alongside as we're all beginning to create courses within our technology donor software platform, Transparent Language. But some of these young folks, the passion they had to document local fishing culture, land-based education around forestry, and land stewardship, and the passion that they showed to do this work in the face of sometimes almost no Wi-Fi or satellite access. So even accessing our platform was a challenge for them, and they were navigating, time zones and technology challenges. But oftentimes, one thing that was driving their passion was the reality of climate change. And so they see the culture changing before their eyes. They feel the ways that it has impacted their identity, their sense of self, their sense of pride, their sense of connection to every generation who has come before them. And they want to make those opportunities available to young people coming after them. And to me, that just resonated so deeply because in many tribal cultures here in the US, we operate according to this concept of 7 generations. And the way we keep time, it's not just about us and the present day, it's about understanding that our language and our culture are like a relative to us. They're always present, and there are so many aspects of our cosmologies and our religious and spiritual practices that revolve around energy and the ways that we're empowered through our spiritual belief systems and our connection to the land and the emergence of our languages from the land around us that has taken care of us for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. And it's something that we want to ensure is an understanding that young people after us can experience as well. So even though I've never been a fluent speaker of either of my languages, Lakota or Dakota, I will never forget as a young person the way that experiencing ceremony in those languages made me feel. And that's something that I think is the most important aspect of not just spiritual practice, but healing and empowerment and connection to a line of kinship that is so much greater than just one person. And that's something that my name reminds me of all the time, is that it's a name that seems very esoteric in some ways. It has these religious origins and these very kind of heavy aspects of responsibility that come with it. But at the same time, it reminds me that I'm just one Ptesanwin in this time. I'm just one Ptesanwin from Standing Rock. And there are women like me all over Lakota and Dakota country who are also carrying forward names from a treasured grandmother, great grandmother, and every single one of those matriarchs and every single one of those women has their own story of power and responsibility and love, most importantly, love for our families, for our children and grandchildren. And that's something that resonates across every young person I meet who is wanting to share their language. It's because we want to be able to pass on these aspects of our culture that don't translate into English. And
Mm,
even if we're not the most proficient speaker, it's important for us to know the prayer songs. It's important for us to know the seed songs, the planting songs, the songs and rituals and practices that are part of every season in every community. And I think that's so powerful that whenever young people who are working in Indigenous or endangered language contexts, whenever we come together, we always find ways to uplift one another. And we find these parallels that are so striking because it's surprising that someone in Sierra Leone who's focused on forestry stewardship and working with elementary children in 32 schools, that young person can find resonance with a young Menominee woman working in the forests of Wisconsin, or a young Kumeyaay language teacher who's working on the border of Canada, or sorry, on the border of California and Mexico. And it's the same passion that they share for the generations before them, but also the generations to come. And it's really wanting to preserve that knowledge base, but also that connection to where our languages have come from. And every single different culture has a story of our language's emergence from the natural world around us. So in my Lakota community, we learn about the meadowlark and how the meadowlark has brought language to our people. The meadowlark signals the return of spring, the Lakota New Year. In Ojibwe communities, it's the goldfinch. The goldfinch is the keeper of language. And every community has these
yeah.
really unique aspects of where did language come from in our community? And how has it made us unique as people? And how has it made us diplomats and peacemakers and caregivers and stewards of our homelands and our communities?
How has it, Jennifer? How has it? And how do you help the communities that come together to learn of this pathway that you've just described so beautifully for us of reflection, learning, celebrating, and sharing?
So I think it's something that's already embedded in our language communities. And so the people who come to us, I think that the young people who come to us and want to build these courses within the transparent language platform that we have been gifted with stewarding and teaching about at 7,000 Languages from our technology donor and partner, these young people already have this passion. They already have this understanding of how foundational languages and how
Mm,
much it is at risk. And most of them, by and large, are usually multilingual. And, sometimes we're building courses for French dominant speakers or Spanish language dominant speakers.
yeah.
Here in tribal communities in the US, it's often English, of course. But increasingly, one thing that has really shocked me in the last year of being at 7,000 Languages is meeting so many young people who are incredibly multi-tribal and have a desire to be incredibly multilingual. So we have a new Indigenous Languages Advisory Board, and we have one member who documents her ancestral connections to 6 different tribes and is impassioned as a parent that her children will be exposed to ceremony and learning opportunities in all of those languages. And it's entirely possible in this digital age that we're in. I think of some of our courses in places like the Pacific Northwest, where we've built a course, for example, in a trade language like Chinukwawa, which is almost like a Creole. So it was a language that tribes adapted words from European languages, one another's languages, but it was sort of parallel to the many different sign languages that also existed for trade and diplomacy across this continent, across this hemisphere. And I think that our ancestors have always been incredibly multilingual. That's something we
Mhm.
learn about in our old traditions, that in our region in the Northern Plains, folks spoke not only Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, but they also could speak Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, our sister languages along the river, along the waterways that connected us, that were our superhighways before colonization and before America. There was so much vitality and communication among tribal communities, trade and exchange, and intermarriage were very common, and so was multilingualism. So was even knowing different regional sign languages. So that is something that I think it's really easy to get discouraged in the current climate and in this year where we've experienced things like executive order around English language, but it's just not the reality that most people live in this nation, much less in this world. You know, it's much more common in other countries for people to speak 3, 4, 5, or 6 languages. But that was a tradition here in Indian country among all of our tribal nations for millennia. And I really believe it's something that young people today have the passion and the interest in redeveloping and reclaiming. And that surprised me because I've spent so much time just thinking about my local home languages. But coming to 7,000, I've met folks from other Siouan languages who I didn't even understand that we were relatives before. So I'm thinking of Siouan languages of the Southeast, for example, like the Catawban language or the Monacan language. And these are languages that folks are actively working on reclaiming and using sister language documentation to rebuild their local languages. And that's a process I had the opportunity and the tremendous privilege to witness over about a decade of work with the Wampanoag tribes here in Massachusetts, where linguists, these tremendously talented linguists and teachers and their community have rebuilt the Wampanoag language from 3 versions of the King James Bible from the 17th century and through their communications and learning with sister languages that are still spoken in the Algonquian language family. So I think young people today are just so savvy about these interconnections among our language families. And they're also really tired of this declension narrative of always focusing on how our languages are so endangered and they're so challenged. And they really just want solutions and access. And that's what's really exciting to me about being at a place like 7,000 Languages, where we've been granted this access to this tremendously dynamic software platform from Transparent Languages. And we are constantly approached by communities from all over the world about ways that they can tailor this platform to serve their local needs, their local priorities. And it might be they want to teach preschool teachers. They might want to focus on, agroecology practices in the Southwest in a desert landscape. I mean, the approaches and the focus that young people bring to our fellowship program and to our quarterly workshops that we facilitate, it's just tremendously dynamic to see their enthusiasm, their commitment, and their fluency in technology. That's very humbling for the most part. I'm still, I haven't been with 7,000 for quite a year yet, so I'm still learning about the platform and all of the different activities that reinforce learners' proficiency journey. But at the same time, it's been so incredibly inspiring to see the ways that young people and our own team members are able to harness these local goals to build learning proficiency through a tool is, it's accessible anywhere. And then we have lots of young people who are also working on new ways to, build apps that will function offline. It's just really exciting to see the enthusiasm that young people have for language education today.
It's exciting just to listen to this. And the word dynamic was coming to my mind, and then you said it out loud. And it does give me a sense, and you will repair my visual here as you feel it might need. But sometimes it feels like there's pavement being poured over a natural soil area. And these seeds are pushing their way through the things that would cover it, the things that would keep it from being able to sprout and to flourish and to grow. And it's exciting to hear that. And when you said young people are getting tired of this story that languages will be crushed, they themselves can bring it back in multilingual format. Are we speaking here primarily when these young people are working on the work that you do with 7,000 Languages and the rest of the impact that you have? We're talking primarily spoken language. What role does written language play in ensuring the strengthening and growth and resilience of a language?
I think it depends on each local community. There are Indigenous languages here in the US that run language schools that do not write their language. So when they focus on literacy, they may focus on English literacy, but they, in some cases, have prioritized orality as the means of transmission for their language. In other cases, I'm thinking of Cherokee Nation and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, for example. They have more than one way of writing their language. So they have an entirely unique internally designed syllabary from the 1800s that brought Cherokee Nation to tremendous rates of literacy, even during a time when they were experiencing mass relocation by then, that administration who was acting in violation of Supreme Court orders that should have let Cherokee people stay in their homelands in the Southeast. But that orthography has 86 characters, and it's something that Cherokee learners today in Cherokee Nation and Eastern Band immersion schools, they learn the orthography before they ever learn the Roman alphabet. And they also can write their languages phonetically using the Roman alphabet, but they have their own completely unique syllabary that was designed by a genius educator from within their own nation almost 2 centuries ago. And every community has their own local writing system. It might be an orthography based on Latin characters. During the pandemic, I had for the first time the opportunity to take sustained Lakota language courses with some education organizations on Pine Ridge and on Standing Rock. And it was so much fun to see folks logging in from coast to coast. And we all got to, practice our gutturals and try to, make new sounds that we just don't get to use in English language or in Spanish language. But it was also so fascinating to see that even during that time of tremendous loss and grief in our communities, I had one relative who came up with an entirely new writing system for Lakota language based on florals. So there's a tradition of beadwork that is called Dakota and Lakota florals in our community. And he invented a new way to write our language using florals. He sent me a graphic the other day of Ptesanwin in his Dakota florals.
Wow.
Orthography. And it's a work of art. And I think he was inspired by an elder from our neighboring reservation from Cheyenne River, from the Curley family, who previously had made a writing system based on phases of the moon. And so I think every community is capable of that genius. And sometimes as educators, there can be a tendency to think, oh, we have to standardize. We should only write this one way. And it reminds me of the debate around, standard American English and how we just sort of accept that there's Australian English and English that's spoken in the UK, and there's American English. And every local community in many of our nations has come up with their own unique writing systems. Sometimes they're linked to tribal colleges, tribal universities. Sometimes they're linked to a particularly powerful local tribally operated school that just, had a base of elders who were really dedicated to curriculum development. I think among the Chickasaw Nation, I learned from some of their linguists that they have 23 different ways of writing Chickasaw language.
Wow.
I think in Lakota country, we probably have a similar proliferation among Dakota and Lakota and Nakota, sister languages, some of which are mutually intelligible. So there's tremendous diversity in the ways that we write and express our languages locally. But to me, that's again a sign of vitality. It's a sign of the tremendous passion that we have for our languages. And in this era of coding languages, and we take for granted the technology that we're communicating on right now and the languages that are embedded within our technology. And so I don't think it's beyond the realm of daily functioning or daily education that we can't learn more than one way to write our languages locally as well. And I think, again, young people are willing to embrace that. And when I see, a 5-year-old at Cherokee Nation who already knows the syllabary fluently, that is so inspiring to me that they have, mastered this 86 character work of art, essentially, that comes from their own local history. And then they're also going to learn the Roman alphabet, and that's going to be no big deal because that's, a third of the number of characters that they've already mastered as a kindergartner.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hi, Norah Jones here. Please connect up with me on my website, fluency.consulting, to learn more about my guests, Subscribe to know when podcasts, videos, and blogs are released, to let me know if you'd like to be a guest, to get Team Humanity gifts for yourself and others, and, if you can, to support my work with a donation. That's fluency.consulting. I deeply appreciate your listening and sharing. There's so much here of the, again, energy and joy and the plasticity of human beings, the very natural language center that we all have and how it can blossom fully. On the site of 7,000 Languages, Jennifer, there is a 5-step values and visions here, including respect and collaboration. And maybe if you can help us to understand what those values and visions are in 7,000 Language and why those are the values and vision, and what might that have to say to what dominant languages in various cultures might be considering if they have not already done so.
Yeah, I think I'm just so grateful to our board. And I was a member of our board a number of years ago, but I was not part of these discussions that developed and defined our values and our vision. So you started with respect and collaboration, but we also foreground empowerment and ownership, diversity and inclusion, technology and community access, and vision. And the ways that we are and living our values, I think is going to vary in every community, but we're always going to follow the lead of the local community. We're always going to rise to meet their priorities. And their priorities may have nothing to do with our current strategic focus or our goals for launching new language courses. Their local priority could be around youth leadership. It could be about empowering a new generation of ceremonial leaders, or it might be about passing on traditions revolving around planting and irrigation in some of the most arid climates in this country. I mean, I think that very often language education in the contemporary context for Indian tribes has been placed in school settings almost exclusively. And that's, I think, a reaction to this devastating impact that boarding schools had on our communities. There's no denying how devastating that was intergenerationally, the impacts of the suffering that our parents and grandparents were subjected to, they still endure, and they're tremendously painful. And I think, we're witnessing now the work of the Native American Boarding School Healing Project and the recent apology from the Biden administration and the work of Secretary Holland, who launched this full-scale federal inquiry into documenting these boarding schools and their impacts and the deaths of young people in these institutions. So that part it's horrifying. And I think that sometimes we have reacted to that by wanting to transform every school into a place where language is going to be offered as a subject of instruction. And it's not always practical and it's not always welcomed in some communities. So, for example, there are many places in tribal communities where there may be language that is part of ceremonial practices or annual gathering or planting or kinship or medicine societies. All of these different local cultural institutions, they may not feel welcome in a public school setting. They may not feel safe in a federally funded school space. They may want to keep knowledge private to their community, and that's okay. I think that we sometimes have this sense of academic inquiry as needing to be open access and available to all. But in our communities, knowledge is earned in the local tribal space. It's granted to you because you're going to put it to use, because you're taking the responsibility to carry it forward and to give it meaning through your life and your actions. And sometimes a school is not the only place that language should be taught. And so we are definitely seeing, I think, increasing numbers of local partners who want to build courses for an immersion camp or with a land-based education focus where they can maybe scaffold content from a school setting, but they're not building a course to be taught in school because we want our languages to live everywhere. We want our languages to be in media, on the radio, in podcasts, in film and television. We want our young people to be empowered to write poetry and produce plays and perform opera in our languages. Like there's just endless possibilities for the ways that our languages can and will continue to thrive in this new digital space. And schools and standardized languages are not always the most direct or respectful approach for some of these dimensions of language proficiency, language leadership. I think they're important places for fostering culture-based education and multilingualism and respect for one another's values and our differences in the ways that we worship. I mentioned when I was introducing myself that Standing Rock, where I grew up, has been influenced by many denominations of religious practice, and that's not a bad thing for us. It brought a new kind of diversity into our communities. And I have friends and loved ones who are Catholics and Episcopalians and Congregationalists and Baha'is and, from all these different world religions. But many of them also feel very strongly that they are Lakota and Dakota first, and they want to pray in that language, they want to worship in that language, and they want to practice our traditional ceremonies as well. And sometimes that aspect of our languages doesn't have to live within a school. We also have many partners who are focused on medium education, so immersion education, where they want to teach every subject in their language. And that is incredible and powerful. And the communities that are able to pull that off, I think we all are just blown away by their capacity for teacher training, and we would love to emulate that. I'm thinking, of course, of the Native Hawaiians and their network of preschool through postdoctoral study opportunities in their language. And I think they're coming from a very unique history where one language was spoken on their network of islands, and they were uniquely impacted by U.S. imperialism and had this incredibly powerful generation of young parents and elders who came together and changed their state constitution to make Native Hawaiian an official language after it had been outlawed. And so they are really a focus of goal setting for many of us. Many folks in Indian country at tribal colleges and universities have visited Native Hawaiian immersion schools or Hawaiian medium schools, but we may not all have the capacity to emulate those similar classrooms. But at the same time, we can integrate language into many other aspects of our lives and many aspects of our communities.
That's such a wonderful and balanced story. What other experience in a particular linguistic group, cultural group here have you seen that you're like, this is a wonderful story to tell too? This is an inspiration for others. You've mentioned many inspirational things. Is there another area where you're like, and here's another example of the kind of creativity and dedication that is an inspiration and, for those who wish, a potential opportunity to emulate?
As you were talking, I started thinking about all of our teacher partners in Alaska. So Alaska has over 200 tribal nations or Alaska Native village communities that are all self-governing. And because of the vastness of their geography and their tremendous linguistic diversity, they have been able to make all of their Alaska Native languages official languages of the state. So that mandates interpretation, translation from everything when it comes to public meetings, to voting, to public notices of all types, healthcare services. That is a tremendously inspiring process that I don't think many other states have that kind of standing. I know in South Dakota, for example, there was a movement several years ago to make our languages official Indigenous languages, but not official languages of the state. And that was only changed very recently within the past year, that now interpretation is required for Lakota language, for example. But that's existed in Alaska for decades. And they have some of the strongest speaking communities in public schools and charter schools, in, small village-run schools. And they also have come up with, even just within the past maybe 2 years, they've added new official languages because their delineating between what maybe some linguists might call dialects, but the communities are saying, no, these are distinct languages. And this language is part of this river watershed, and it's completely distinct from this watershed over here. And it's important that we document this in policy, in state law. And they've also been tremendously creative in putting together these regional frameworks for supporting one another and for creating digital resources. So I think that has been a really rich source of partnership, but also inspiration for 7,000 languages. We learn so much from the Native Alaskan teachers who have been doing work in the digital space for decades in some cases. They might even be, the second generation in their family to be designing digital language tools. And sometimes that's driven by a sense of urgency because it may be young people who grew up learning from a relative who's no longer with us, and that relative was a first speaker. And, so there's a sense of urgency in wanting to create these tools and preserve those voices so that other young people can learn from them. But at the same time, it's also a sense of not just responsibility, but also a sense of wanting to communicate that joy and that connection to younger people, and to say that there's a deeper history to our landscape. Every mountain peak, every waterway, every watershed in Alaska has been treasured and cherished in these local languages for tens of thousands of years. And English and Russian are brand new baby languages in those spaces, and they don't have the right to reinscribe and remap and completely reshape those landscapes. And I think young people in Alaska are so impassioned about returning Alaska Native names to sacred spaces, to state and national parks. And that's something that is really inspiring as well. Not just, the educational tools that they're developing, but also the ways that they're so committed to reinscribing Indigenous languages on their ancestral landscape, because those mountain peaks or those waterways, those are considered relatives as well. And, I think in many, many Indigenous languages, we talk about mountains or hills or mountain chains as ancient ones. And there are stories about how they emerged, and, they're part of our families too. And so when I think about a region that I think is really leading the way in the U.S., for tribal communities, I definitely think about all of these tremendously talented educators across the state of Alaska.
It is inspiring indeed. And I'm thrilled, frankly, that very important aspect of dialect as a language. And when it refers to a segment of beloved ancient family geography, in this case, too, it's absolutely essential. That's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. The 7,000 languages as an organization. And folks go to my website, fluency.consulting, to see information from you and links that you've provided, and go to the website here it's the number 7000.org. 7,000 is a number that has meaning as a warning as well as a celebration. Can you make sure that all the listeners know what that 7,000 is standing for, Jennifer?
Yeah, so linguists in recent decades have put a tremendous amount of research effort into documenting the world's languages and to delineating the world's languages and framing different aspects of language vitality and language survival odds sometimes, which I think is not always helpful in terms of focusing on endangerment. But of course, we all want to know, what's the starting point? What is the number of, and I think it's a bigger number than 7,000, actually. There are more than 7,000 languages in the world. And so we have a very ambitious number that's part of our name. And I think we're at we're closing in on 95 language courses this year. But I think the number of distinct languages that we've worked with is still hovering around 60 or 65. So I was very humbled recently when I met with some high school students who quickly did some math and told me the very tiny percentage of the world's 7,000 languages that we have addressed so far.
Getting there.
But I think that the number of courses that you see on our website, it's misleading in some ways because we do have this tradition of facilitating quarterly workshops that are free for community members to come in and start learning about the platform. And they can actually start building their own course by participating in a workshop. And, the reality is that it's a tremendously painstaking process. And it does also require a lot of technical support and a certain level of skill around understanding foundations and linguistics and the writing system, if there is one. And so there's just so many layers that go into creating these courses. And so they really benefit from being able to find some funding sources that can really support people's time to put into developing really in-depth courses that are going to lead to proficiency. And we don't always get there with all of our communities. But I think when I started last June, we had maybe 60 or 70 different language courses sort of in the queue. So in some stage of development, and maybe 40 of those have advanced in some significant way over the past year. So it's a lot of different communities to track. There's a tremendous range of approaches that people are taking. And so our lead project coordinator and our assistant project coordinator, who's been with us since I think she was an intern, like they are just they're both trained linguists. One is working on her second master's degree in computational linguistics. So they're tremendously dedicated. They live and breathe world languages, and they are so committed to the work in every community and meeting every community where they're starting from. And sometimes communities are, they're just sort of getting a feel for what might it look like to entrust one of our most precious resources into this technology platform. And so they may not get very far for maybe even a year or two. And others come in with a full textbook or a mentor apprentice guide, and they have a whole plan. And, they just crank it out because they have a fantastic funder or, support of a school system or maybe, community development corporation. So we have all different kinds of partners. Sometimes it's a tribal college or university. And then overseas, I think that our partnerships are even more diverse in places like Latin America and Africa because languages are still emerging into digital spaces. There's so much less representation in the digital space for Indigenous and minoritized languages. In some cases, languages have been deliberately suppressed. We worked with a young woman a couple of years ago before my arrival who was working on the Gagauz language from Ukraine. And, that is an area where, we haven't really been able to maintain regular contact with that community. There are other places in, Afghanistan, for example, where we've had course partnerships start and stop many times through the years. So obviously technology access is it's a blessing and a curse. It can be a barrier, a tremendous barrier. And so I'm really grateful to our network and family of language fellows who really seem to stay connected after their time with us and find ways to continue building and improving their courses. Often there's a lot more content than you'll see that's accessible to the public on our website because folks are granted back-end access. So they can continue to add new units, new lessons, and they can set the permissions for their community. So we've had some communities recently that have made prayer courses because 2026 just felt like a really challenging time for many reasons in some of our communities. And I was pleasantly surprised when some of our partners said, we're going to create a prayer course and we're going to operate this virtually for our community, maybe through Teams or Zoom or something like that, but they're using the content and the platform, but they don't want it to be public. And that's okay with us. That's completely fine with us. And we would, never violate that trust or, we do the best we can to protect the public language content, even from data scraping and all the ways that large language models and AI are increasingly invading Indigenous language spaces without permission. And we're seeing now that tribal nations, tribal governments are drafting and enshrining their own local policies around data sovereignty and the use of AI, because there is a tremendous fear of misrepresentation based on centuries of misrepresentation of Indigenous languages and cultures in the research literature and popular culture, et cetera, et cetera. So we're very focused on, whichever aspect of the platform communities want to use. And we always ask that there be some public course that we can make available, but that doesn't always happen. We do our best because we do want to also be a space for cross-cultural appreciation. And we do find that many communities want to see visitors and guests come to their homelands and show the respect of having learned a greeting or learned the significance of local place names. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for the public to visit our site and learn, local alphabets, local greetings, kind of survival language. But there's also a lot more content that's really, behind the back end that we may never have access to. And that's 100% okay with our team because we want to support, again, the local communities and their priorities. And that's part of our commitment to data sovereignty and to respecting local leadership, whether that is a tribal council or an institutional review board or, whatever the local framework looks like. We do our best to ensure that we're respecting what the local practices are around languages and language access.
There's so much insight into the very deepest nature of language that you've shared here, Jennifer. It's blowing my mind. The sense of, first of all, the treasuring of language, what it is used for, how sometimes it is private, the dangers that it faces when it can be scraped by the technological tentacles that are out now. All of these things, such a deep insight because the language is treasured for so many specific, very precious, personal, cultural reasons. Thank you for sharing that. What else, before we end today, would you like to reiterate for my listeners, or that you feel like you haven't yet said that you don't want us to end without you saying? However you would like to interpret that, what do the listeners need to hear from you before we end today?
I think I just want to share my gratitude for all of my teachers within the past year as I've joined 7,000 or rejoined 7,000 in this new role. I've learned so much from my colleagues on our board, on our advisory board, among our fellows, but I've also thought so much about the tribal communities who I have been in contact and in learning spaces with since maybe 2006 or so, when I first took on professional roles that involved language education and language resources. And that was around documentary production at that point and, translating interviews and creating curriculum resources. But I just think that as a young person from a tiny community on Standing Rock, I think my hometown was about 800 folks. And I said at the start that I went to the same school, K-12, and I had so many tremendous teachers in my home community. And when I first began working in tribal government, I just think of those policy giants who were shaping and even national policies around food sovereignty and around water rights and land stewardship and environmental protection, and taught me so much about navigating state and federal and even county and municipal jurisdictions that aren't meant to protect Indigenous rights or respect Indigenous languages or even acknowledge us as an ancestral presence that extends into deep time. And so I'm so grateful for having the mindset that I do, that I'm a very cross-cultural person. My father is non-native. He came to Standing Rock when he was a teenager and never left. He still works for our tribal government. So I don't consider myself to be, a Lakota expert on anything because I'm a very cross-cultural person. But I am just so grateful for the trust that my elders and my teachers, and not just in the education system, but within our system of tribal government, the ways that they have showed me through their own courage and tenacity and resilience, how to rebuild institutions that, just weren't meant to survive in our local spaces. And then having had the opportunity to work through the years with organizations like Cultural Survival, for example, or the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, I was just so deeply mentored by so many giants in Indian country who I think have just been exemplary models of compassion and just a willingness to give of their own life experiences and to just always emphasize that there's always a path forward for our language and our culture. The odds always feel really long and we are bombarded constantly with this idea that our languages don't have relevance in the modern world. And I think if I had not had all of these incredible teachers through the decades, I turned 50 very recently, and I'm so humbled looking back and thinking about these giants who I learned from, people like Wilma Mankiller and Billy Frank and Red Gates and, people from many different reservations and walks of life who made a path for our tribes and our tribal governments to thrive in policy spaces, but also to reclaim resources that were promised to us in treaties. And we do also have a very strong tradition in my family of remembering our ancestors who did not ever sign treaties, who refuse to acknowledge those cessions of land or of rights. And I think that's an important aspect of our communities as well to keep in mind. But yeah, I just have so much gratitude that I was so nurtured and loved by all the families who I mentioned at the very beginning. There's so many powerful lineages that span far beyond Standing Rock, into Minnesota and Montana and Canada. And, those are very real kinship networks that I encounter every time I travel. And it might be, meeting somebody from an ally nation, like among the Cheyenne people or the Nez Perce, or in my work with the Wampanoag, we learned so much from folks at Penobscot and Passamaquoddy and Mi'kmaq and Sac and Fox and Meskwaki. And it's just always been tremendously uplifting to be able to step into spaces and to be welcomed as somebody who's there for language and somebody who's there, carrying forward ancestral names that really, they're part of my core. And yeah, I just have so much gratitude for all of those generations of teachers. And I hope that, the resources that we're making accessible for young people online, I think at last count, we have about 28,000 language learners in our network.
Wonderful.
And I hope we can continue to grow that exponentially because like I said, I've experienced so much passion and interest and enthusiasm from young people, or not just one mother language, but, a half dozen or more mother languages. And I think that being a multilingual person is entirely possible for these younger generations. And it is really exciting to see them embracing these opportunities. So thank you for this opportunity to visit with you. And I've just really appreciated this opportunity to reflect on the work of this past year and, the things that have led me to this place today.
Jennifer Weston, thank you. Thank you for sharing so deeply and so fully. And as you continue to invest and to receive, thank you for what you're bringing to the world. Thank you for all the gifts that are being given to everyone through what you're opening in all of your work. Appreciate you being my guest today.
Thank you, Norah.
I hope that you enjoyed this fascinating conversation with Jennifer Weston, and I hope that you will check out her information, resources, links, and insights on my website, fluency.consulting. Please continue the journey yourself of considering your personal identity and history and the connection of language in your community, in your life, and in the lives of all of us in these societies we call the nations and communities of the world. Until next time.